We're going to start with Bart Wilson from U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. So, welcome, Bart, and thanks for being here with us.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. Um, so I'm going to start everything with kind of a very upper level kind of overview of kind of some of our lessons learned, but also some of the perspective of Fish and Wildlife Service and a lot of our partners. So when we think about marsh restoration, oops, one of the things we've really changed in the list, 5, 10 years, one of our biggest lessons learned from Hurricane Sandy was to kind of take on restoration as more of ecosystem focused, where move away from species specific restoration, and really prioritize that ecosystem level restoration. So looking at a functional system, and that includes, again, we're looking at, the marsh edge to the upland interface to transgression. And one of the pieces that commonly gets forgotten is kind of that transgression zone that we're trying to incorporate more, but that's that messy piece that sometimes we forget about. And, one of the things we've kind of had is that, in that tunnel vision that we're trying to move out of is, again, like moving out of that species specific goal. And, I was at a conference last week and I made a joke about something very similar about how, I'm Fish and Wildlife Service. If I don't mention salt marsh sparrow at least once per presentation, they dock my pay. So, and then like, we're guilty of anybody of this, where we kind of focus on this one species and this one habitat type, but we kind of miss the bigger picture of like a healthy system, and a healthy system is a resilient system. And some of that is, looking at multiple levels of restoration when you're looking at a site: edge erosion, invasive species, hydrology, elevation, but also kind of like the topography, the elevation, and kind of that time frame. So I think one of the pieces that we're really incorporating more is that the temporal aspect about this, where what are the time phases of this and kind of what is the distribution of habitat types over time. And that's where that transgression piece really comes into play. And like in that tunnel vision, we kind of get focused on things. And here's some examples of where, we can kind of think of transgression, or, of kind of this movement of these ecosystems landward. And, there's a lot of different very, textbook definitions of these, where it's like to the far right is like the geologic time scale, where like, sea level position, and this interface is a dot, where other ones it's very dynamic. The runaway barrier model is a very dynamic thing depending on, you know, your tidal prism, sediment, sea level rise, and that can really vary about how we think about transgression. But one of the things I kind of think about it is that we have transgression of barrier systems where, we're not allowing the barrier system to, move or evolve. And we're not, then also there's that upland interface where we're not allowing them to evolve. And I think some of the projects we're tackling, it kind of almost go two different ways of kind of like looking at that. But see, within these textbook definitions of what we think of transgression, and it was already mentioned, are these types of things: anthropogenic alterations. We had a laundry list of them. No matter where you are, you see them on the landscape. But one of the things I also, from a geologic perspective, like to think about is that the unintended consequences, where sometimes there's things that we really meant well, but have, caused a stain on the shoreline, a stain on the landscape that are moving through time. And I'll even include rock structures when we put like revetments. These are speed bumps in time. They're not dynamic. They don't evolve with sea level rise. They don't evolve with these systems. And a lot of times they either are ineffective over time, or a lot of times they have these unintended consequences, refraction, reflection, and cause other problems. And that's where I joke with some people I know that, the whole idea of making a revetment, backfilling it with sand, we call it the Chesapeake Special. If someone brings that to me for a living shoreline or shoreline restoration project, I'm like, just get out. Like, I don't even want to hear anymore. Like, we need to do better than that. And I think that's where that idea of like, how do we kind of do better with kind of the restoration model that incorporates all facets of this? Because for me, a lot of that plays into this is that, Bombay Hook National Wildlife Refuge in Delaware is a good example of this, where, you look at the evolution of the landscape, where this one picture with the gray and red, where this is basically the footprint of the refuge wetlands. And over the last 40, 50 years, there's a huge amount, the red areas are wetland loss. So you can see there's the shoreline erosion, this is the highest rate of shoreline erosion in the state, but then you have a lot of interior loss. And it's kind of one of those ideas like, why do we have so much interior loss near that upland boundary where we should be getting transgression, or it should be a stable area? And it's one of those things when you look at that area, that's where we have these impoundments. We have these man-made levees that are not allowing the marsh to evolve with up in the upper boundary. But also what it's doing is causing the tidal waters to bulge up in front of it and cause marsh loss in front of it. So not only these transgression zones opportunities for marshes to move through time, but also impediments in them can actually have a deleterious effect on the evolution of the marsh in front of it in general. So that's why it's really important when we look at these transgression areas that it's not just how it's going to move in the future, but what is it doing now to your existing conditions in your system? And I think that's where, a lot of us are really taking a more heavy-handed role of like facilitated transgression, where it's like, we'll hear a lot of examples of fire. We're really looking at using bulldozers to start changing the topography of the upland interface, but also somehow we design some of these barrier systems where making sure that we are facilitating rollover and movement of sediment. Because a lot of these barrier systems, we've cut them off from sediment supply for a long period of time. And so that's where, like, you think about some of the restorations projects we think about with transgression. We have our barrier island restoration, which is that back barrier marsh where the sand hasn't been overwashing, hasn't evolved. So these marsh systems have been cut off. So the barrier system is basically a point in time that we're fixing in time. And so it's eroding on the front and on the back. So we're not allowing the transgression of that system. I know Winley will probably touch on these. We've done a lot of these projects in Rhode Island, Chincoteague, Long Island, Chincoteague. This is an area where it was a former impoundment on the barrier that we're trying to restore to a natural system, where it's like we're trying to build up the back barrier platform using dredge material from the Army Corps, but also trying to restore the whole suite of habitats within it. So it's like that whole system can kind of propagate through time naturally without kind of like once we kind of set it on a stage, it can go. And some of the more classic things that we're developing now is one that our one of our coastal program staff, Sam Apgar on Long Island, is working on is Shinnecock Inlet with the Corps, where it's a classic model where the Corps is like, hey, we want to do restoration. And if you look at the upland interface in that area, like there is no opportunity for upland interface to do, marsh restoration or transgression. But what we can do is focus on what's the back barrier system? How is that back barrier system transgressing? It's no, it's eroding out, it's falling apart. And that's where in some of these imagery, we've identified sites and calculated the volume that we can put on these back barriers to remake these systems more invigorated, but also do nearshore sediment placement, open water displacement to kind of also build up some of these tidal flats that help to deliver sediment over time into these systems. But ultimately, we're always thinking about like a restoration across the entire ecosystem. And that's where it gets tougher, but that's the model. And for me, obviously, it always starts with, when everyone hears my name, they're like, oh boy, how long until Bart starts talking about Prime Hook? And well, it only took me 7 minutes or 5 minutes. So Prime Hook obviously was a very massive restoration project, 4,000 acres, but it was that model of like, okay, how do we look at the ecosystem where we did a huge amount of beach and dune restoration, and then a lot of the interior plumbing, hydrology restoration to get the system working effectively. But also, it's like there's so many other components of it that we couldn't even get to that are one of our next speakers will kind of talk about the next steps because we're out there, we're dredging, we moved 2 million cubic yards of material, we're restoring the natural hydrology. And, once the water level is stabilized, we got a system like this where we're like, oh, look at all these great mud flats that we can restore with seeding and planting and natural propagation. And one of the things that kind of resulted from this is we had such an impacted system where, saltwater intrusion had killed the forest and the upland interface that we had massive amounts of ghost forest. If you look at this bottom image, you can see that's, basically toothpicks all over the landscape. And within those areas was Phragmites. And Phragmites had a stranglehold of the upland interface. So we spent years just, and again, you can always take the scalpel or the sledgehammer approach. We had to take the sledgehammer approach to this landscape restoration. And that's so this I make a lot of people uncomfortable. I am more of a landscape with a sledgehammer restoration because a lot of times these systems are so broken. We need to clean slate a lot of these aspects. There's some we can kind of tweak and modify, and other ones we really have to go after. This was one where you can see in the map off the right hand side, we were spraying frag thousands of acres a year to try to set the stage for future restoration because at this iteration of it, we couldn't get to those detailed aspects of like high marsh restoration, transgression, but we were trying to set the stage to kind of, okay, we need to do something. And, some of that we're doing on private lands now in smaller scales, where Maryland coastal bays, where we're actually going
Bart,
in
you
with
have
heavy
one minute.
equipment. Thank you. we're actually going into the upland interface in these ag fields and doing shallow water features for migratory waterfowl and using that sediment and putting it in the marshes. And what's that allowing us to do is it's creating these a little bit better corduroy for marsh migration through the system where, that sediment is again building up the marsh that is just completely fallen apart. And we're doing hydrology restoration, but it's the elevation is a little bit better to kind of contour or kind of integrate into these areas. So being very heavy handed and kind of integrating both. And one of the things we're allowing to do is in Maryland, I was a little early with my little timer of my little stylus there was that area right there is, you know, heavily impacted marshes that have their time frame for their long-term resiliency lifespan is so short. So we're being heavy-handed of bringing in the material, restoring hydrology, also creating what's that transgression into these ag fields. And I think where I'll leave this is that um, there's a lot of ongoing efforts within the Mid-Atlantic between Fish and Wildlife Service and NOAA to kind of create, not to how-to manuals, but sideboards, the guidance of how to think about these things. And the QR code right there will send you to this where, an ecosystem approach to restoration, where it's again the sideboards. How do we kind of think about changing habitat types? Because again, we are losing these marsh systems. We're creating high marsh. We're thinking about all these different aspects. And one of the other things that we're going to be kind of working on now is dedicated use for dredging. So dredging for the sake of restoration. And I only bring that up in this is that there are opportunities where, it can go both ways. We're taking sediment from the upland interface and bringing it into the marsh, but also we could be dredging canals, we can dredge in waterways and bring sediment up to better integrate into that transgression. So these are the things that a lot of us are trying to think that again, Mid-Atlantic focused, but I think there is some applicability to New England in time. So that is all I have.